Your daughters are being poisoned! Dr. Sarah Mitchell's voice shattered the afternoon quiet of the palace bedroom as she held two medicine bottles high above her head, her housekeeper's uniform, unable to conceal the authority of someone whose chemistry doctorate had been earned through years of rigorous study before circumstances had forced her into domestic service. Beside her, Sheikh Ahmed al-Thani stood frozen in his white kandura and traditional headdress, his expression shifting from confusion to devastation to raw fury as his hand clenched into a fist while his mind struggled to process the horrifying implications of what his employee was revealing. Behind them, on the luxury bedroom floor, sat his twin daughters, Amira and Layla, both 7 years old in their matching silk dresses, their pale faces and dark-circled eyes telling the story of 6 months of systematic poisoning that had baffled a parade of pediatric specialists who had attributed their declining health to everything from rare genetic disorders to psychiatric conditions. What none of them yet understood was that Sarah's background in toxicology and analytical chemistry had enabled her to recognize poisoning symptoms that others had missed, and that her investigation had uncovered a conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of the royal household, with motivations that would shake the foundations of the Al-Thani family's power and wealth. The Al-Thani palace rose like a jeweled crown from the heart of Abu Dhabi's most exclusive district, its architecture blending traditional Arabian design with contemporary luxury in ways that showcased both cultural heritage and the natural gas wealth that had transformed the emirate over recent decades. The royal family's private quarters occupied an entire wing of the compound, with bedrooms larger than most homes and amenities that included private medical facilities, entertainment centers, and educational spaces where the sheikh's children received instruction from tutors flown in from elite institutions around the world. Sheikh Ahmed al-Thani commanded one of the region's most substantial fortunes through strategic investments in energy infrastructure, real estate development, and technology ventures that positioned him as both traditional ruler and modern entrepreneur. His influence extended beyond business into cultural preservation and education initiatives that aimed to prepare the next generation of Emiratis for leadership in an increasingly complex global economy. His twin daughters represented not just his personal legacy, but symbolic continuity of family traditions that stretched back generations through the region's history. The mysterious illness that had been slowly consuming Amira and Layla began 6 months earlier, with symptoms so subtle that they were initially dismissed as normal childhood ailments or reactions to the demanding schedule of lessons, activities, and social obligations that filled their days. The gradual progression included increasing fatigue, digestive problems, cognitive difficulties that affected their academic performance, and physical weakness that made activities they had once enjoyed feel exhausting and unpleasant. Sarah Mitchell had accepted the housekeeper position 4 months earlier through a domestic staffing agency that specialized in placing educated professionals who had been unable to secure employment matching their actual qualifications. Due to credential recognition barriers, visa restrictions, or personal circumstances that had forced career transitions into service work that utilized only basic skills while wasting years of specialized training and expertise. Her background included a doctorate in analytical chemistry from Cambridge University, where her dissertation research had focused on detecting trace amounts of toxic substances in biological samples using advanced spectroscopic techniques. Her expertise included intimate knowledge of how various poisons affected human physiology, the time courses over which different toxins produced symptoms, and the analytical methods necessary to detect substances that might escape routine medical testing if physicians weren't specifically looking for evidence of deliberate poisoning. The transition from promising academic career to domestic service had been necessitated by family obligations that required her presence in the Gulf region where her elderly parents had retired, combined with employment discrimination that prevented her chemistry credentials from being recognized by local institutions that prioritized graduates from regional universities over international qualifications, regardless of their actual merit or relevance to positions being filled. Her daily responsibilities in the Al-Thani household included cleaning the children's rooms, organizing their belongings, and ensuring their living spaces met the exacting standards expected in a royal residence. The position provided income while allowing her to remain near her parents, But the waste of her training and expertise created frustration that she tried to channel into careful observation of everything around her, her scientific mind, unable to completely abandon the analytical thinking that years of research had instilled. The symptoms that caught her attention were initially just concerning, rather than obviously sinister. But her toxicology training created pattern recognition that made her notice details others might dismiss. The twins' symptoms worsened after mealtimes in ways that suggested gastrointestinal involvement. Their cognitive difficulties fluctuated with timing that didn't match typical childhood development or learning disabilities, and their physical deterioration followed progression curves that her research experience told her were more consistent with cumulative toxic exposure than genetic disease or psychological conditions. Her investigation began informally through careful observation of the children's routines, their food and medication, and the people who had regular access to them. The analysis that her training enabled her to conduct mentally included considering which substances might produce the observed symptom pattern, how those substances might be administered without detection, and what motivations might exist for someone to systematically poison two young children whose deaths or incapacity could reshape succession plans and power structures within the extended royal family. The breakthrough came when she noticed that the children's symptoms were consistently worse after taking their daily vitamins, supplements that had been prescribed by their pediatrician to address nutritional deficiencies that medical testing had identified. Her request to examine the medication bottles was initially met with resistance from other household staff, who viewed her interest as inappropriate overstepping of her duties, but her persistence eventually enabled her to obtain samples that she could analyze using techniques that didn't require sophisticated laboratory equipment. The chemical tests that Sarah conducted in her modest apartment, using supplies purchased from hobby chemistry vendors and repurposed household items, revealed the presence of heavy metals in concentrations far exceeding therapeutic or nutritional levels. The specific combination of lead and arsenic she detected was particularly alarming because these substances were known to produce cumulative toxic effects that could cause permanent neurological damage and organ failure if exposure continued without intervention and treatment. The confrontation that brought her evidence to Sheikh Ahmed occurred when she could no longer remain silent while watching the twins deteriorate under her care. Her presentation of findings was delivered with scientific precision, despite the emotional intensity of accusing someone in the household of attempted murder. Her chemistry expertise, enabling her to explain exactly how the poisoning was occurring and what symptoms would continue developing if the exposure wasn't immediately halted. The initial skepticism that greeted her accusations was predictable, given that she was making extraordinary claims based on amateur testing rather than official laboratory analysis. But the urgency in her voice and the detailed scientific knowledge she demonstrated while explaining her findings convinced Sheikh Ahmed that her concerns deserved immediate professional investigation, regardless of how unlikely the scenario seemed, or how uncomfortable the implications might be for family relationships and household dynamics. The emergency medical evaluation that followed included comprehensive toxicology screening by specialists who confirmed everything Sarah had discovered through her improvised testing. The heavy metal levels in the twins' blood and tissues were dangerously elevated, their bodies showing clear evidence of chronic poisoning that had been occurring for months, while pediatricians had been treating symptoms without considering that deliberate toxic exposure might be the underlying cause of their mysterious decline. The criminal investigation that was launched immediately identified the source of poisoning as the children's vitamin supplements, which forensic analysis revealed had been systematically tampered with through careful injection of toxic solutions that left minimal visible evidence of the bottles having been compromised. The sophistication of the tampering indicated knowledge of chemistry and access to specialized equipment, narrowing the suspect pool to individuals with both technical capability and opportunity to access the medications regularly. The arrest that followed the investigation exposed Sheikh Ahmed's younger brother Rashid as the mastermind behind the poisoning plot. His motivation rooted in succession planning and inheritance disputes that would be resolved in his favor if Ahmed's direct heirs were eliminated or permanently incapacitated. The conspiracy included medical professionals who had been bribed to provide the supplements while concealing evidence of tampering, household staff who had been paid to ensure the children received their medications consistently, and family members who had been manipulated into supporting Rashid's positioning for increased power and influence. The interrogation revealed that the poisoning had been planned for over a year, with conspirators conducting research about substances that would produce symptoms mimicking natural diseases, while avoiding detection through routine medical testing. The selection of heavy metals reflected understanding that these toxins would accumulate slowly while creating progressive damage that might not be immediately recognized as poisoning unless specifically suspected and tested for by physicians with appropriate toxicology expertise. The legal proceedings that resulted from exposing the conspiracy became international news as the full scope of the plot was revealed through testimony and evidence. Rashid faced charges including attempted murder, conspiracy, and abuse of authority, while his co-conspirators were prosecuted for their roles in facilitating crimes that could have resulted in the deaths of 2 children or permanent disabilities that would have affected the rest of their lives. The medical treatment that Amira and Layla received following exposure of the poisoning included chelation therapy to remove heavy metals from their bodies while addressing organ damage that had occurred during months of toxic exposure. The pediatric toxicologists who supervised their care were cautiously optimistic that early intervention would prevent permanent harm, though ongoing monitoring would be necessary to ensure their development proceeded normally without lasting effects from the poisoning they had endured. The transformation of Sarah's circumstances following her life-saving intervention was dramatic and swift. Her chemistry expertise was finally recognized and valued appropriately, with offers flooding in from universities, research institutions, and private companies seeking her analytical skills and toxicology knowledge. Her transition from housekeeper to senior research scientist occurred within weeks, her new position offering compensation and professional recognition that finally matched her qualifications and capabilities. The credential recognition reforms that were inspired by her case included new assessment procedures that evaluated actual competence rather than simply verifying institutional affiliations, creating pathways for qualified international professionals to contribute their expertise while addressing legitimate concerns about maintaining standards and ensuring patient safety in contexts where credentials from unfamiliar institutions required verification. The toxicology awareness programs that Sarah helped develop following the case focused on educating parents, caregivers, and medical professionals about recognizing signs of deliberate poisoning that might be dismissed as natural illness if the possibility of toxic exposure wasn't considered. Her curriculum emphasized that sophisticated poisoning attempts often mimicked diseases, requiring high index of suspicion and appropriate testing when symptoms didn't respond to conventional treatment, or when progression patterns seemed inconsistent with diagnosed conditions. The security protocols that were implemented throughout royal households following exposure of the conspiracy included enhanced screening of medications and supplements, with testing requirements ensuring that anything consumed by protected individuals had been verified as safe and authentic. The measures reflected recognition that wealth and status attracted sophisticated threats that required equally sophisticated defensive approaches, combining technology, procedures, and human vigilance by personnel trained to recognize potential dangers. The family reconciliation that occurred following the crisis focused on healing trauma that extended beyond the immediate victims to affect everyone who had trusted Rashid and been betrayed by his willingness to murder children for personal advancement. The therapy that supported this healing process addressed both the poisoning itself and the deeper wounds created by discovering that family bonds had been violated by someone whose ambition overwhelmed any loyalty or moral restraint. The legacy of Sarah's intervention extended beyond saving 2 lives, to encompass transformations in how credential recognition occurred, how household security was approached, and how society valued expertise that existed in unexpected places. Her courage in speaking up, despite her vulnerable position as a foreign domestic worker, had not only prevented tragedy, but exposed systematic problems that affected countless other qualified professionals whose talents remained wasted due to arbitrary barriers and discriminatory assumptions about whose knowledge deserved recognition and respect. The international attention that followed exposure of the poisoning conspiracy included investigative journalism, revealing similar cases where domestic workers had detected problems that escaped notice of highly paid professionals, with Sarah's story serving as catalyst for broader examination of how hierarchies prevented effective communication and collaboration across social boundaries. The media coverage sparked conversations about how expertise could exist anywhere, while conventional systems created blind spots that prevented recognition of knowledge that didn't come packaged with appropriate credentials, institutional affiliations. The forensic toxicology laboratory that Sarah established with funding from Sheikh Ahmed and other wealthy families became a premier facility for detecting sophisticated poisoning attempts while providing training for medical professionals who needed enhanced skills in recognizing toxic exposures that might mimic natural diseases. The laboratory's work included developing rapid testing protocols that could be deployed in field settings, creating databases of poisoning patterns associated with various substances, and conducting research that advanced scientific understanding of how toxins affected human health across different populations and exposure scenarios. The diplomatic incidents that resulted from discovering that some conspirators held positions in foreign governments included formal protests and extradition requests for officials who had provided technical assistance to Rashid's poisoning plot in exchange for promises of favorable treatment once he assumed control of family wealth and political influence. The international cooperation that was required to prosecute these individuals tested diplomatic relationships while establishing precedents for holding government officials accountable for participation in criminal conspiracies that targeted private citizens, including children, whose only offense was being born into succession lines that others coveted. The child protection reforms that were implemented following the case included mandatory background checks and continuous monitoring for anyone with regular access to children in wealthy households, with particular scrutiny applied to family members whose financial interests might be served by removing heirs from succession plans. The protocols reflected tragic recognition that familial relationships provided no guarantee of safety when substantial wealth and power were at stake, requiring protective measures that might seem excessive in normal families, but proved necessary when fortunes numbered in billions and succession disputes could motivate murder. The psychological research that was conducted on the twins' recovery process provided insights into how children processed and healed from betrayal by trusted family members, with findings that influenced treatment protocols for other victims of intrafamilial violence and abuse. The longitudinal studies that tracked Amira and Layla's development demonstrated remarkable resilience when appropriate support was provided, though subtle effects of their trauma continued manifesting in ways that required ongoing therapeutic intervention and family support to prevent lasting psychological damage. The educational curriculum that was developed for chemistry students included Sarah's case as example of how scientific knowledge could be applied outside traditional laboratory settings, with emphasis on ethical responsibilities to use expertise for protecting vulnerable populations, regardless of whether such applications aligned with conventional career paths or professional expectations. The case studies inspired students to consider broader applications of their training, while reinforcing importance of maintaining analytical thinking and observational skills, even when circumstances forced them into positions that didn't utilize their full capabilities. The insurance industry response to revelations about sophisticated poisoning attempts within wealthy families included development of specialized policies covering costs associated with toxic exposure, with coverage extending from medical treatment through security measures designed to prevent deliberate contamination of food, medications, and household products. The underwriting process for these policies incorporated risk assessments that Sarah helped develop based on her analysis of how Rashid's conspiracy had operated and what warning signs might enable earlier detection of similar plots. The technology platforms that were created for monitoring medication integrity included tamper-evident packaging with chemical indicators that changed color if bottles were opened or injected with foreign substances, along with blockchain verification systems that tracked medications from manufacture through consumption to ensure authenticity and prevent substitution or contamination. The innovations that emerged from analyzing how the poisoning had been accomplished created entirely new markets for security products while providing protection that could prevent similar crimes. The legislative reforms that were enacted following the case included enhanced penalties for poisoning family members, with recognition that betrayal of trust relationships created unique harms deserving special consideration in criminal sentencing. The laws also addressed conspiracy involving medical professionals who violated ethical obligations by facilitating poisoning while concealing evidence from patients and families who trusted them to provide legitimate care rather than participate in murder plots. The professional ethics training that became mandatory for chemists and toxicologists emphasized responsibilities to report suspected poisoning, even when doing so might create personal or professional risks. With Sarah's courage in speaking up, despite her vulnerable employment status, serving as model for how ethical obligations sometimes required prioritizing protection of innocent victims over preservation of comfortable relationships or career stability. The international conference series that was launched to address family violence and succession-related crimes brought together law enforcement officials, mental health professionals, legal experts, and security specialists to share knowledge and develop comprehensive approaches to protecting vulnerable family members from relatives whose financial motivations might overcome moral restraints. Sarah's presentations at these conferences became influential in shaping policies and practices while inspiring other professionals to recognize and report suspected abuse regardless of the social status or wealth of families involved. The scholarship fund that was established in honor of Amira and Layla provided educational opportunities for children of domestic workers and immigrants whose parents' talents had been underutilized due to credential recognition barriers, with programs designed to ensure the next generation could achieve success matching their abilities rather than being limited by circumstances of their birth or nationality. The fund reflected commitment to breaking cycles where systemic discrimination perpetuated inequality across generations. The memoir that Sarah authored about her experience became an international bestseller, with readers drawn to her descriptions of how scientific training had enabled her to recognize poisoning, while her immigrant status had made her vulnerable to dismissal and disbelief when she tried to report her concerns. The book provided insights into both the technical aspects of toxicology and the social dynamics that prevented expertise from being recognized when it existed outside conventional hierarchies, inspiring other professionals whose circumstances had forced them into positions that failed to utilize their training. The corporate partnerships that Sarah's laboratory developed with pharmaceutical companies and medical device manufacturers created opportunities for translating her research findings into practical applications that could benefit broader populations beyond wealthy families who could afford specialized security measures. The collaborations produced innovations in medication safety, tamper detection, and poisoning prevention that became standard features in products sold globally, while generating revenues that funded continued research and training programs. Before we wrap this story up, I'd like to thank you for reaching this far. And if you enjoyed this story as much as I think you did, then be sure to show your support by liking and subscribing so this channel can reach more people like you. Now, back to the story. The policy advocacy work that Sarah undertook included testimony before legislative bodies considering reforms to credential recognition requirements, whistleblower protection laws, and domestic worker rights that could prevent other qualified professionals from experiencing the systematic dismissal and vulnerability that had nearly prevented her from saving the twins' lives. Her first-hand experience provided compelling evidence for the need to strengthen protections while creating pathways for immigrant professionals to contribute their expertise without sacrificing economic security or legal status. The family bonds that developed between Sarah and the Al-Thani household transcended gratitude to become genuine relationships based on mutual respect and shared commitment to ensuring that the twins' experience led to positive changes, protecting other children from similar dangers. Sheikh Ahmed's public acknowledgement of how his assumptions about domestic workers had nearly prevented him from recognizing Sarah's expertise became a powerful statement about the importance of humility in recognizing where knowledge and wisdom resided regardless of job titles or social positions. The unexpected element that made Sarah's story so compelling was not simply that she had scientific knowledge enabling her to detect poisoning, but that she had possessed courage to speak up despite every systemic factor working against her being heard or believed, proving that moral character, combined with expertise, could overcome enormous obstacles when the stakes were literally life and death. And when individuals chose principle over safety, in moments that determined whether justice would prevail over evil conspiracy.